Imagine a man who wakes up every single morning, puts on his white coat, walks into work and signs death warrants for thousands of people, and genuinely believes he is making the world a better place. And the most terrifying thing about this story is that this man was not some anonymous lunatic hiding in a basement somewhere. He was a respected professor, an SS general, and the personal physician of Adolf Hitler himself. The man that the Führer trusted with his own life every single day for years. And his name was Karl Brandt, one of the most dangerous and overlooked men in the entire history of the Third Reich, someone who somehow managed to escape the level of attention he truly deserves. And by the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly why his story should disturb every single person alive today. Karl Brandt was born in 1904 in Mulhouse, a city that itself could not decide whether it was German or French, which is a strange and almost poetic detail when you consider that Brandt himself would spend his entire life unable to decide whether he was a healer or a killer. Growing up in the household of a military officer where discipline and order were not suggestions but absolute laws, where weakness was something to be eliminated rather than understood, and where the idea of German superiority was not a political opinion but simply a fact of life that nobody questioned. And this environment shaped the young Karl Brandt in ways that would eventually lead to the deaths of over 200,000 innocent human beings. By the time Brandt entered medical school, he was already exactly the kind of student that professors dream about. Brilliant, focused, completely dedicated to his work. The type of person who stayed in the library long after everyone else had gone home, who memorized everything, who asked sharp questions that made his teachers uncomfortable in the best possible way. And on the surface, there was absolutely nothing about this young man that would suggest he was capable of what was coming, because the most dangerous people in history are almost never the ones who look dangerous. They are the ones who look like the last person you would ever suspect. And Karl Brandt was a perfect example of exactly that kind of person. His connection to Hitler began in 1933 in a way that sounds almost too random to be real, when Brandt happened to be present at the scene of a car accident involving relatives of Hitler's companion, Eva Braun. And he treated the injured so effectively and so calmly under pressure that word reached Hitler himself, who was immediately impressed and invited Brandt to become part of his inner circle. And just like that, almost by accident, this young, ambitious doctor found himself standing at the center of the most powerful and most murderous regime in modern history, surrounded by men who would reshape the entire world through violence and terror. And Brandt fit in perfectly because he genuinely believed in what they were building. What made Brandt so uniquely terrifying was the fact that he never saw himself as a murderer, not even for a single moment, because in his mind, everything he did was rooted in cold scientific logic and the greater good of the German people. And this is the part of the story that should make you genuinely uncomfortable, because it is easy to dismiss a monster when the monster knows it is a monster. But Karl Brandt went to his grave convinced that history would eventually understand that he was right. And the program that would define his legacy and seal worst human beings who ever lived was something the Nazis called Aktion T4, which was a systematic government program designed to identify, select, and murder every single person in Germany who was considered mentally ill, physically disabled, or simply not useful enough to deserve to continue living. The logic behind Aktion T4 was presented in the language of medicine and compassion, which is what made it so deeply sinister. Because the official argument was that these people were suffering, that their lives were a burden to themselves and to society, that eliminating them was not an act of cruelty, but an act of mercy. And Brandt embraced this argument completely and enthusiastically, not because he was forced to, not because he was following orders in the way that so many Nazis later claimed at Nuremberg, but because he genuinely and intellectually believed that what he was doing was correct, and he used his position as Hitler's personal physician to push this program forward with the kind of medical authority and legitimacy that made it harder for anyone inside the system to resist or question.
The mechanics of how Aktion T4 actually worked are the kind of details that stay with you long after you stop thinking about them. Because this was not chaos or spontaneous violence. This was a bureaucratic, organized, medically supervised system of mass murder that required doctors, nurses, administrators, paperwork, schedules, and budgets. And at the center of this machine was Karl Brandt, overseeing the process with the same calm professionalism that he brought to treating Hitler's minor ailments. And the victims were collected from hospitals and care facilities across Germany, transported to specially designated killing centers, and murdered using carbon monoxide gas in chambers that were disguised as shower rooms, which you might recognize as the direct predecessor to the technology that would later be used in the Holocaust on an even more massive scale. Over 200,000 people were killed through Aktion T4 before the program was officially suspended in 1941. And the word officially is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because the killings did not actually stop. They simply became less centralized and more difficult to track, continuing in various forms until the end of the war. And among the victims were children, elderly people, veterans who had been injured fighting for Germany in the First World War, people whose only crime was being born with a condition that the state had decided made their life not worth living. And every single one of those deaths passed through a system that Karl Brandt helped design, legitimize, and operate with the full backing of the most powerful government in Europe. But Aktion T4 was not even the only crime on Brandt's record. Because as the war progressed and the Nazis began searching for ways to gain military advantages through science, Brandt became deeply involved in the human experimentation programs that were being conducted in concentration camps across the Reich. Experiments that subjected prisoners to hypothermia, high-altitude pressure, infectious diseases, surgical procedures without anesthesia, and dozens of other forms of deliberate torture dressed up in the language of scientific research. And Brandt's involvement in overseeing and approving these programs added another layer to a legacy that was already staggering in its cruelty and its scale. What is remarkable about Brandt's psychological profile is how completely normal he appeared to everyone around him, because the people who knew him personally consistently described him as charming, intelligent, genuinely warm in personal interactions, devoted to his family, someone who laughed easily and made people feel comfortable in his presence. And this gap between the private man and the public monster is something that historians and psychologists have been trying to understand ever since, because it forces an uncomfortable question about human nature itself, which is whether the capacity for this kind of evil exists in ordinary people under the right circumstances, or whether men like Brandt were always something fundamentally different from everyone else and simply good at hiding it. As the war began to collapse around the Nazi regime in 1944 and 1945, the relationships within Hitler's inner circle became increasingly paranoid and unstable. And Brandt himself fell out of favor after Hitler became convinced that Brandt had sent his own family to territory that was about to fall to the Americans, rather than keeping them in Berlin as a show of loyalty. And in a moment of extraordinary irony, the man who had signed the death warrants of hundreds of thousands of people was himself sentenced to death by the Nazi regime he had served so faithfully, though he managed to survive long enough to be captured by Allied forces before the sentence could be carried out. The Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946 and 1947 was one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials held after the main tribunal, and Karl Brandt sat in the dock as the highest-ranking defendant. And what made the trial historically significant beyond the specific verdict was the way Brandt conducted his own defense, because rather than expressing remorse or attempting to minimize his role, he argued coherently and at length that what he had done was medically and ethically justifiable, that the concept of mercy killing was not a Nazi invention, but a legitimate medical debate that existed throughout the world. that the human experiments had produced valuable scientific data that could save lives, and that history would ultimately judge him as a man who had the courage to make difficult decisions that others were too weak to face. The tribunal did not agree, and Karl Brandt was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. And on June 2, 1948, he was executed by hanging at Landsberg prison in Bavaria, the same prison where Adolf Hitler had written Mein Kampf 2 decades earlier. And in his final statement, Brandt said that he had acted from pure motives and that if he had to face the same choices again, he would make the same decisions, which is either the most honest thing a condemned man has ever said or the most chilling, depending on how you look at it. And honestly, it might be both at the same time. The legacy of Karl Brandt matters beyond the historical facts of his crimes, because his story is a masterclass in how intelligent, educated, professionally respected people can become instruments of mass murder when they surrender their individual moral judgment to an ideology that gives them permission to stop seeing other human beings as fully human. And the medical profession specifically has spent decades grappling with the lessons of what happened in Nazi Germany, precisely because the doctors who participated in these programs were not failures of the medical system. They were, in many cases, its stars, its brightest minds, its most decorated members. Which means the problem was never about competence or intelligence, but about something much harder to measure and much harder to fix. The 200,000 people who died because Karl Brandt believed their lives were not worth living had names and families and memories and futures that were stolen from them by a man in a white coat who convinced himself that murder was medicine. And the reason their story needs to be told and retold is not to satisfy some morbid curiosity about the darkest corners of history, but because the mechanisms that made Aktion T4 possible, the bureaucratization of violence, the medicalization of prejudice, the dehumanization of the vulnerable, the surrender of individual conscience to institutional authority, none of those mechanisms disappeared when the war ended. And understanding how they worked in the hands of someone like Karl Brandt is the closest thing we have to a defense against.
Thanks for watching.